Imagine the 1800s, a time of immense change and transformation. The world was on the brink of a new era, and nowhere was this more evident than in Europe. Europe was buzzing with activity. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, bringing about rapid advancements in technology and industry. Factories were springing up everywhere, and new inventions were changing the way people lived and worked. These factories needed raw materials to keep their machines running and to produce the goods that were in high demand. Europe, however, didn't have all the resources it needed. So they looked beyond their borders. Their eyes turned to Africa, a continent rich in natural resources. European explorers and adventurers began to map out the vast and largely uncharted territories of Africa, driven by the promise of untold wealth. Africa was a treasure trove of valuable resources like gold, diamonds, rubber, and other raw materials. These were exactly what the European factories needed to fuel their industrial ambitions. The race was on. European countries scrambled to claim as much of Africa as they could. This period of intense competition and colonization is known as the Scramble for Africa. The Scramble for Africa was marked by a frenzy of land grabs, treaties, and sometimes outright conflict. European powers carved up the continent with little regard for the existing African societies and their complex cultures. Before the Europeans arrived, Africa was home to a multitude of kingdoms, tribes, and communities, each with its own unique culture, language, and way of life. These societies had rich histories and traditions that were often overlooked by the colonizers. The European powers, however, paid little attention to these existing boundaries and social structures. They drew new borders that often split communities and forced different groups together, leading to long-term conflicts and tensions. The colonizers believed they were superior to the African people and justified their actions with a sense of entitlement and racial superiority. They exploited Africa's resources with little regard for the well-being of its inhabitants. European factories had an insatiable appetite for raw materials. Africa's vast reserves of rubber, diamonds, gold, and other resources were extracted and shipped back to Europe, fueling the industrial machine. The division of Africa among European powers was like a grand feast, with each country grabbing as much as they could. This period left a lasting impact on the continent, the effects of which are still felt today. Something important happened in Europe that changed Africa forever. This event would set the stage for a dramatic and often tragic reshaping of the African continent, altering its future in ways that are still felt today. It was called the Berlin Conference, held from 1884 to 1885. This conference was a pivotal moment in history where the fate of an entire continent was decided without its people's consent. Germany's leader, Otto von Bismarck, brought together 14 European countries and the United States. These powerful nations convened to discuss their interests in Africa, driven by a desire for new resources and territories. They wanted to decide how to divide Africa among themselves. The map of Africa was laid out before them, and they began to draw lines, carving up the continent with little regard for the people living there. They made a rule called effective occupation, meaning if a European country controlled a part of Africa, they could claim it. This rule was meant to legitimize their claims and prevent conflicts among themselves. The worst part? No Africans were invited to this meeting. The very people whose land was being divided had no say in the matter. Their voices were completely ignored. The lines they drew on the map split up groups of people who shared the same language and culture. These arbitrary borders created divisions that led to conflicts and tensions, the effects of which are still evident in Africa today. Before the Berlin Conference, Africa was a continent of diverse cultures, languages, and societies. African leaders governed their own territories, and communities thrived with rich traditions and histories. But the decisions made at the Berlin Conference led to a period of intense colonial exploitation. European powers extracted resources, oppressed local populations, and imposed their own systems of governance, often with brutal force. Despite the lasting impact of these colonial borders and the challenges they created, African nations have shown incredible resilience. Today, they continue to rebuild and reclaim their identities, striving for a future that honors their rich heritage and diverse cultures. At the Berlin Conference, they decided Africa's fate. European countries now felt they had permission to take control of Africa. They used their powerful weapons and armies to take over. Even though Europeans had better weapons, Africans fought back bravely. Sometimes European countries tricked African leaders into signing treaties that seemed like agreements for protection, but really gave away their land. Taking over Africa was violent and cruel. Many Africans died from fighting, hunger and sickness. Even though Europeans were powerful, Africans didn't give up. They faced overwhelming odds, with European forces often better armed and more numerous. Yet the spirit of defiance burned brightly across the continent. All over Africa, people resisted. Some fought with weapons, others used clever diplomacy, negotiating with European powers to protect their lands and people. These acts of resistance were not just about physical battles, but also about preserving their way of life and asserting their right to self-determination. Many worked tirelessly to protect their culture, ensuring that their traditions, languages and customs were passed down through generations. This cultural resistance was a powerful form of defiance, as it kept the essence of African identity alive despite the pressures of colonization. Samori Touré, a great leader in West Africa, fought against the French for many years. His military strategies and relentless spirit made him a formidable opponent. He established a well-organized army and used guerrilla tactics to challenge the French forces. Even though he lost in the end, he became a symbol of African resistance. His legacy lives on, inspiring future generations to stand up against oppression and fight for their freedom. Ya Asantewa, a queen in what is now Ghana, also bravely led a rebellion against the British. She rallied her people and led them into battle, showing incredible leadership and courage. Her defiance was a beacon of hope for many. Her courage is still remembered today. Monuments and celebrations in her honor remind us of her bravery and the enduring spirit of resistance that she embodied. Her story, like many others, is a testament to the unyielding strength and resilience of the African people. The scramble for Africa wasn't just about land, it was about money. European factories needed resources and they took them from Africa. King Leopold II of Belgium controlled a huge area called the Congo Free State. He forced the people there to work on rubber plantations and millions died from the terrible conditions. This happened all over Africa. Europeans took gold, diamonds, cocoa and other resources, making African countries poor. Europeans also wanted to change African culture. They sent Christian missionaries to convert people. Missionaries built schools and hospitals which helped some people, but they also tried to make Africans forget their own cultures. Missionaries sometimes helped colonial governments because they knew the local languages. The missionaries changed Africa in both good and bad ways. They brought education and healthcare, but they also hurt African cultures. After World War II, things started to change. European countries were weaker and African countries wanted freedom. This was the start of decolonization. Some countries like Ghana gained independence peacefully, while others had to fight for it. But even after independence, things were difficult. The lines drawn by Europeans caused conflicts between different groups within countries. The scramble for Africa ended a long time ago, but its effects are still felt today. The borders drawn by Europeans still cause problems. Many African countries are still poor because of how Europeans controlled their economies. African cultures are still recovering from the effects of colonialism. But there is hope. Africans are working to remember their history and celebrate their culture. They want the world to know about the wrongs of the past. The Scramble for Africa teaches us about the dangers of greed and prejudice. It's a story of how powerful countries hurt many people. We need to learn from this and build a fairer world. Africa faces many challenges, but it also has a lot of potential. Young people, lots of resources, and a rich culture give Africa a bright future. By understanding the past and working together, we can help Africa achieve its full potential.